Obviously, the biggest comparison people are making to Tower of Fantasy is that it's just a Genshin Impact clone. While these two games are definitely very similar, Genshin Impact feels like a super high quality single player experience, even though yeah, I know there's co-op, while Tower of Fantasy is a bit rough around the edges with a lot of bugs and an overall lack of polish. But it definitely feels more like an MMO, since players are all on their own server, you can party up with randoms, and even start a guild. And let's be real here, Tower of Fantasy isn't a ripoff of Genshin Impact. Tower of Fantasy is a ripoff of Zelda Breath of the Wild, just like Genshin Impact is a ripoff of Zelda Breath of the Wild. At the very least, Tower of Fantasy's got some different game mechanics. Despite the general jankiness, Tower of Fantasy is actually a lot of fun. The combat is fast-paced and responsive, and each weapon has their own unique skills and combat functions, such as healing, breaking shields, etc. Now, before we go a little bit further in the video, we do have to address the elephant in the room. Tower of Fantasy is, in fact, a gacha game. Gacha basically refers to a gambling system, so like characters and weapons or materials to end up making your character stronger. All of this stuff is accessible free to play with the option of spending money at a chance of getting it faster. Now, just in case you're just tuning into this video and not my Genshin Impact review, Genshin Impact was actually my first ever gacha game. So I didn't really know the amount of psychological manipulation that gacha games do in order to convince players to spend money. Time-gated progression being the most obvious. So I've been going into Tower of Fantasy keeping this in mind and trying not to spend any money. And I gotta say that this game is very generous when compared to Genshin Impact. So a free-to-play player in Genshin Impact might take a few months of saving to get a 5-star character that they want, or sorry, a chance at getting a 5-star character that they want. Whereas in Tower of Fantasy, despite being completely free to play, I've already got like 4 or 5-star characters. Anyways, with all the gacha stuff out of the way, let's talk a little bit more about the game. So the main mechanics with Tower of Fantasy is obviously going to be advancing the main story, but on top of that, exploration is going to end up rewarding you with wishes to end up getting the characters that you want. The cool thing is that when you do end up getting a character, they are essentially going to end up just being a skin that you can apply. So what you're actually wishing for in the character banner is the weapon itself. So at any point you could end up using the vanity skin that's associated with the weapon, or you could just use your own custom character with the weapon. Exploration starts out pretty slow, especially because the climbing is just terrible in this game. But thankfully it gets rectified almost immediately when you end up getting your hands on the jetpack, and a little bit later on you'll end up getting enough materials that you can craft yourselves the grappling hook. Because throughout your adventures you'll end up getting relic shard boxes, and I highly recommend that you end up getting your hands on the grappling hook first and foremost before you bother crafting any other relics. Here's a quick trick. When you're hanging on a wall, you can press Control to let go, and if you don't press any buttons, you'll generally just fall straight to the bottom. Instead, what I'm going to ask you to do is press Control to let go of the wall, and then double jump right after, and then press W to move forward so that your character will grab the wall again. If you repeat this action over and over again, you'll be able to scale up any wall in the game without spending any stamina. Anyways, this isn't a quick trick guide or anything like that, so let's get into the meat and potatoes of the game, which is going to end up being the most flashy aspect, the combat. I actually really enjoy the combat in this game because it allows you to cut off your attack animations in order to end up avoiding damage. Essentially, each of the different weapons in the game is going to end up having a different element associated with it, which is going to end up having certain strengths or weaknesses depending on the enemy that you're facing. You can always dodge out of the way of an enemy attack, but if you end up dodging at the perfect time, you'll end up getting this weird slow-mo effect, which allows you to end up dealing heaps of damage to the enemy. Now, as much as I love the idea of this combat in practice, the execution, however, is very busted. And almost every battle in the game essentially boils down to an enemy puts on a shield, you break their shield, deal a certain amount of damage before they reapply their shield. Now, the point that I'm getting at with this is that the game definitely has potential, but it hasn't really reached it yet. So at the moment, I'm gonna end up giving this game a 2 out of 5. I'm still really enjoying playing through this game, but I think that almost anybody who's played this can also agree with me in saying that the quality of this product is just not really there yet. I am very hopeful, and I do think that this game does have a much higher ceiling than most games do in order to end up growing. But time will tell whether or not this game ends up reaching its full potential or burying it under more clunky game mechanics. That said, I'd still recommend that you try Tower of Fantasy for yourself. I feel like Genshin Impact players that may have gotten tired of the game might be able to appreciate the fast-paced combat of Tower of Fantasy, janky as it may be. Also, the fact that this game leans much more heavily on being an MMO rather than a single-player game with co-op.